Thank you all for inviting me here. It was interesting, I just counted up the room. We're about 125, and 30% are youth. Wow. And I just did a quick check, and the census showed that 29% of Canadians are actually under 24. So we have a proportional representation. Yes. And all that implies. So I'm going to chat about a variety of things. I will likely depress you, by the way. I'll try and lift you back up a little bit, but if you're going to tell the truth, you somewhat have to face up to some of the realities of where we sit. Now, I'm with Clean Energy BC, and we are basically the professional membership association for independent power producers in British Columbia. There's our mission statement. I've only been with the organization for a year, but I changed our mission statement to align us with effective climate policy and electrification, and doing this the cheapest, fastest way possible with the lowest risk. The reason for that is because in British Columbia, there's been a lot of perspectives that renewable energy is expensive. And actually what's interesting, I just came back from the Canadian Wind Energy Association conference in Calgary last week, and wind is now officially the cheapest form of electricity production in the world. We're there. So, now we produce as a membership about 15% of the electricity here. That's with run-of-river, wind, and solar. A minuscule amount of solar, I might add. We've got very, very little solar in BC. We've got a fair amount of wind, but we've only made use of less than 0.25% of our wind resources thus far. So there's a lot more power we can still produce. And we've just recently written a white paper called The Electrification of British Columbia, and I've got a couple here. We released that 2 weeks ago because we realized quite quickly that there was a lot of talk about climate policy in BC and in Canada. I've noticed this for all the 20 years I was in Europe. Everybody keeps talking about climate in Canada, but we just don't seem to be walking. We like talking. We miss our targets. We're one of the worst performers in the world. We're actually per capita one of the highest emitters on the planet. We are at the bottom of the rung. And it's amazing how most Canadians don't even know that. We're sitting there with Australia, which two countries that you wouldn't really associate that much with being dirty. But we are amongst the dirtiest on the planet per person. Even BC, with this amazing green grid, only roughly around 1/3 of our energy comes from electricity and 2/3 comes from fossil fuels. So yes, that 1/3 is really green, but the 2/3 isn't. And we use so much more energy than most people on the planet. My house on Bowen Island, which is only 10 years old, uses 3 times as much energy as my house in the UK, which was built in 1942. Which is surprising. Fine, my house in the UK was upgraded and improved upon, but that's quite a shock that we're still building houses that are pretty poor performance. And what was interesting is we noticed that in BC, our First Nations relationships are so important. We did a study in 2017 asking First Nations what their views were on clean energy, and what was really amazing is 98% of the respondents said that they were very positive or positive about clean energy. 98%. I mean, that's shocking. We had over 50% of all the First Nations in BC respond to our survey, which, by the way, the ministry said was the highest response rate they've ever seen on any survey on First Nations in Canada. So there's a kind of a bit of a support for this. This is the most powerful reconciliation tool available to the government. It's to build local green power. And that's what's so interesting. We've stopped, unfortunately. We're not building anything new now. Well, Site C is a part of it, yes. The other part of it is that there's sort of we're stuck in this in-between stage where people are talking in the government about what they want to do next and how they want to get there. It's a sort of a paralysis stage, which happens quite often when you switch governments after a long period of time. We're going to hopefully know in the next few weeks what the climate policy plan is going to be coming out of the government, at least first phase. I'm not feeling that confident, unfortunately, because nobody in the Clean Energy Working Group or the Energy Roadmap or the Climate Change Policy Strategy teams have been consulted on what's going to come out in a few weeks. So that's interesting. And what's really interesting as well is extensive electrification presents us with one of the biggest opportunities for GHG reduction. You don't have to worry about reading every line. I'll just say most of the important stuff. So there we are, there's BC right now. That's our CO2 emissions broken down, about 61.6 million tons. I will stress what's really interesting is our metrics in Canada are very sometimes hard to find. Having spent 20 years in Europe, the European Union makes it a mandatory requirement for all public data to be made available for free publicly. Not in Canada. We often report on things internationally a year or two in advance of reporting on them domestically, which is crazy. I had to find a lot of these metrics from International Energy Agency, not from Canada, which is just, I don't understand that unless there's pieces that are missing. There's a bunch of sections of the way we're doing things that aren't connected together. But the key point here is that industry is the big one, and transport. And we got built environment is in the red, which is also quite large, and then deforestation is the one in the black. What would be interesting if we looked at this 20 years ago is deforestation would have been a much, much bigger. But our forestry sector is shrinking. And I think you might notice a little bit of it's turning into smoke every year. That is climate change. That is the natural repercussion of this. So what's great about BC is those three sections we can do something about. So here we are today. We're basically the dotted line in the middle. We've dropped a little bit since 2007, a couple percent, and we're planning on dropping 40% by 2030. That gray area is highlighting the fact that everything isn't staying still. We're adding more people, more houses, more cars, more industry, more everything. So we're trying to drop our emissions while at the same time there's a lot more of us here doing more things. So it's more than just a 40% drop we're aiming at, and an 80% drop by 2050. What's interesting as well about this is I've been lucky enough to have worked in 5 countries that have come close to or hit 40% reductions already. When I moved to the UK in 1997, they were exactly as we are right now in 2018. We are 20 plus years behind. It's shocking, but we are. We still haven't done many basic things that a lot of other countries have done. Now, for the youth in the room, those of you that aren't looking at your phones, which is about 12% of you, this is interesting because in the 1970s, your generation would have been very pissed off. I'm surprised you're not. Like, it's shocking to me. You should be banging down the door and getting really upset with your parents' generation and your grandparents, because we are the ones who created this and enabled this to happen. And what is coming is a storm unlike our civilization's ever seen. I would hate to be 18 right now, and I've got an 18-year-old. I'm worried about our future because you know what's scary? If I was honest, the most important skill I could give her is learning how to shoot a gun with the way things are going. I hate to say that, but it is going worse than anybody can imagine, faster than anybody can imagine. 25 years in climate science has showed me one thing: we are failing miserably. And that's because we choose not to do what's necessary. These are choices we have made. If you want to break it down simply, and we talked about this over dinner, it all comes down to one thing. We have a psychopathic, sociopathic finance system that is built on neoliberal economics, which says perpetual growth is good. It's not. It's impossible. Can you name anything that grows perpetually? Cancer. Good analysis. Yeah, and the universe seems to. We think maybe Big Bang will go back one day, but you're right, cancer. Cancer grows perpetually until it wipes out the ability of the system that's managing it and supplying it to survive. Parasites generally do too, until they either dominate or get dominated. Right now, we are behaving as viruses. We are behaving as a parasite. We are behaving as cancer. There is no two ways about it. We are ignoring the feedback loops around us. That's what cancer is. It's a comms problem. Cancer cells lose the ability to understand feedback from healthy cells around them, which tell them stop growing. What do you think we're doing? Exactly the same thing. I said I'd depress you, sorry. I'm trying to be positive. Industry, our biggest opportunity for GHG reduction is industry. It just sits there, it's gigantic. And we have the ability to potentially reduce the GHG emissions of the new LNG sector, which we so interestingly are pursuing at a moment when everything's going the wrong way, by 72%. And the reason why I'm pointing this out, I'm not pro-LNG at all, but I'm pragmatic. And I know in a country like Canada, we're not going to stop doing this for a while. So we need to make every single thing we do next as green as possible. And because our grid is so green, if we electrify every element of that, we actually can make the greenest LNG in the world. And by the way, I mean really not what's being said by LNG Canada. I'm saying the truth, which is that because of our grid, we can actually make it greener than anybody else. But we're not currently doing that. Right now, LNG is going to burn gas to process its gas, because that's standard practice. We couldn't instead choose electrification. And what this highlights is this is what LNG Canada is doing. Phase 1, which includes 2 trains, it's going to be built. This is the $40 billion project. It's going to produce around 7.5 million tons of carbon. We're producing 62 million tons. Pretty big extra chunk. If we were to extensively electrify that, it would be 2.1 million tons. That's still a lot of carbon, but it's a lot less carbon. And that would require us to basically increase our electricity production by 14.2%. Site C is adding 7. This starts to show you how much energy we're going to need. We're going to need a huge amount of power to come close to hitting our targets. We look at the built environment, let's go into heat pumps. This is really interesting. If by 2030, 25% of residential homes are switched from gas to electric heat pumps, air source, and we also switched about 30% of private sector buildings and 15% of commercial, we would end up reducing our emissions from 9.3 million tons to 148,000. That's a 98% reduction in carbon emissions. This is incredible. Very few places in the world can do this. In Germany, in the UK, in France, heat pumps offer about a 45% reduction in carbon. Here, 98, because our grid is so green. Now that's incredible. And what else is here? That would require us to increase our electricity production by 21%. So you start to see, we need a lot of renewable power. And that's why Clean Energy BC is pushing this, because we want more renewable power. Now, if you look at transport, we did this piece of analysis with UVic, and it showed that by 2030, if we had a pretty extensive electrification mandates, where basically 99% of all vehicles by 2030 that are sold are electric. And by the way, this is perfectly easy to do. We could hit these targets way earlier with the way things are going. It would require us basically to increase our electricity production by almost 8%. There's a Site C worth of power. But what's interesting there, if you look at the deep metrics, the yellow band, 84% of the carbon reduction is coming from light, medium, and heavy-duty trucks, not cars. Cars are tiny, they're 14%. It's the trucks where we have the opportunity. And you think the vast majority of these trucks are doing short haul from port deliveries to local areas. Only a small percentage of our trucks actually do long haul, driving up to Fort St. John on an 18-wheeler. When it comes to actual tonnage of freight, it's actually quite small. So it's really interesting. A 1920s electric milk float from the UK could do 70% of that work right now with lead-acid batteries. That's what's so incredible. And if you start looking at the payback period, the return on investment, the economics, the electric bus that was mentioned earlier, the Green Power Bus is the Vancouver company who is producing these buses. They're a member of ours. They've got a 19-seat bus, which is basically a handy dart. Handy dart costs $100,000. Their bus costs $200,000. Their bus is a $50,000 grant. It's not $150,000. Their bus saves $45,000 a year in fuel and maintenance. There's a 3-year payback period. It's not complicated. In fact, sitting in that bus in Vancouver 3 weeks ago with the chief engineer for Handy Dart, he sat there and asked about 7 questions. He sat silently for about 3 minutes, and then he turned to us all and said, "Diesel's gone. It's screwed. It's over." Ding. Here we are. It's economics. It's the economy, stupid. That's what's great. And it's great you're doing that work. And hopefully you're working with Green Power Bus to look at those numbers. So they want to build electric bus fleets across all the Gulf Islands and the Island Trust. They think that's a really unique focal point to bring the brand, and I love it, so we're trying to help them. But if you look at 2040, this is where things get really interesting. By 2040, most of the old internal combustion vehicles are gone. They're dead, they've been used up, they've hit the end of their life. Then the numbers look really exciting. You're looking at about 39% increase in electricity consumption in BC just to serve those vehicle fleets. That's gigantic. That's quite exciting. So here's some positive clean energy indicators. Only 3 countries have not signed onto the Paris Climate Change Agreement. I think we know which one of them is. Nearly 500 American cities have already pledged to meet their climate obligations. 500. It's quite incredible. These cities, along with 15 states, represent more than half of the United States economy. So half of the US is already in the Paris Climate Accord. Right now, the European Union is debating a backbencher bill. If passed, it would require all imported American goods and services to be paid a carbon tax, which the EU would donate on behalf of the American government to the international economy. So they're in it whether they like it or not. It's really interesting. France and the UK are not allowing the sale of internal combustion cars after 2040, Norway 2025, China is considering 2030, bans. Norway is especially interesting. Short-haul flights, those are flights of less than 200 nautical miles, have to be electric by 2030. The first place in the world to say that. This is interesting. Norway is even going all the way down to chainsaws and leaf blowers, electric drills, getting rid of every internal combustion system. Norway, to put in perspective, had basically an oil and gas economy that was twice the size of Alberta's. Over the last 40 years, Norway has managed to put aside $1.2 trillion in the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. Alberta, with half that oil and gas, has ended up with $48 billion of debt. And it's just announced last week, about $240 billion of environmental liabilities because of cleanup. This is a beautiful example of success and utter, complete failure. And that's interesting. The Norwegian oil minister, who did his undergrad in Alberta 30 years ago, who's Norwegian, came back and told Notley's government when they first came in power, we've got a plan for you guys, rip up everything you're doing and copy and paste Norway's model. There you go, I'm done. And what's amazing is nobody's done anything. It's the same old model. So it's really interesting when you think about that. Now Norway, by the way, that sovereign wealth fund has divested 100% of its money from fossil fuels. So it was built from fossil fuels, and it's now no longer in fossil fuels. This is interesting. To put that in perspective, that's the equivalent to every Norwegian having around $98,000 of money in the bank set aside for you. And by the way, free education, and free healthcare, and free transport, and amazing pensions. That's all on top of it. So this is about the economy. That's what's so interesting. And over 100 large companies, actually that's wrong, it's 172 now, have committed to 100% renewable energy. It's called RE100. Canada has one company in that pack, TD Bank. Since 2015, 100% of electricity has been sourced from renewable energy. Wonderful. TD is a beacon. Where the hell are the rest of Canadian businesses? Question, do you know who's in there? Starbucks, PayPal, Amazon, eBay, Walmart, Morgan Stanley. So many big brands you know are in the RE100. But in Canada, we have had an utter deficiency of climate leadership. Utter deficiency. The Canadian banking sector is the most exposed to the carbon bubble, which is what this is called, out of any banking sector in the world. Even Saudi Arabia is less exposed to oil and gas than Canada. It's crazy. It's utterly insane. Our banking system doesn't even take into account climate risk. But then again, neither does BC Hydro and neither does the BC Utilities Commission because they haven't been tasked by the BC government to care about climate. There's so many pieces disjointed here. Anyway, renewable energy trends. This is some good stuff. Wind power costs have fallen by over 50% in the last 5 years. We have solar, PV, falling by 55% in the last 5 years, 19% in the last year alone. So you can see that this is the trend, and it's happening everywhere. Electric batteries have dropped by 77% since 2010, and geothermal power has fallen by 60% in the last 10 years. This is just set to continue. Site C is expected to cost between $120 and $130 per megawatt when it's finished. An average wind farm in BC is about $60 a megawatt right now. So this is what's interesting. If you ask BC Hydro that question, they'll say, oh no, Site C is 65, because they use different accounting methodologies to hide some of the numbers. But it's interesting because we're already there. Wind, solar's already basically kicking the hell out of everything. I've got a big conference I'm putting on November 27th and 28th in Vancouver called Generate. In that, I've got a bunch of speakers coming to talk about it's happening. And one of them is a coal company from Wisconsin's bringing up an executive to talk about how they're shutting down coal plants, replacing them with wind. And not because they like the environment, because it's pure economics. As the Republican governor of North Carolina said, I want wind jobs because those guys are still going to be employed in 20 years. It's interesting. What I'm trying to say is the fight's over. It's just that we haven't realized it yet. So, environmental governance for community leaders. The changing environment, every community needs to know how it will be affected by climate change across the entire value chain. And when I say value chain, I mean everything that you need in order to survive. That's all the food, that's all the fuel, that's all the materials, that's all the economy, that's everything is going to be affected by climate change. And nobody's managing this ship, by the way. Do not believe government is solving these problems for you. They are following the society around them. They are not pushing and leading it. We are a society of governance, not leadership. So don't be under any illusions, and this is specifically for the young. Don't buy any of the lies you've been told that people are running this show. They aren't. No one is. At all. It's that crazy. But that opens the door to you because you start to go, wow, if it's that bad, you can lose your faith in the system. You can lose your faith in politics and lose your faith in economy and society and start to design a real one that works for you. And I think that's so vital because we have bought fanatically into believing in this bullshit we call civilization that ain't going to take us anywhere but down. And it's sad. The smartest guy I know had 2 PhDs at 24. He's a Cambridge professor I used to teach with at Cambridge. And that gun reference I asked you about, he wrote a book called 10 Billion. And I said to him, what are you teaching your son? And he said, I'm teaching him how to use a gun because we're going to need it in the next 5 to 10 years. That's what the smartest people in the world are saying already. This is stupid. We don't have to do this. We could do something so much better like what's happened right here. I love the mutation effect. A solar panel causes somebody to think about energy for the first time in a long time. As people start to think about electric cars, they see more electric cars, they go buy an electric car. It starts to feed itself. That is the positive feedback loop that we need. And you are the only ones who are ever going to create it because nobody above you is. So keep doing what you're doing and ignore everybody else. Don't compare yourself, just lead. This is what we need. Rising costs, people need to know how the community is going to be affected. Bananas are likely, it's been interesting, a friend of mine is an agricultural specialist and she predicts that mainstream bananas will be extinct in the next 20 to 30 years because of a virus that's spreading through them that there is no resistance to it. Bananas are going. Coffee too, by the way. That's probably the scariest one. Yep. Reputation. The link between environment and reputation is strengthening. Society is now beginning to drive a need for this environmental stuff. Very beginning here. But in countries that have already jumped on this, this is bog standard. In Switzerland, when you pick up any item on the back of it, place of origin is written down to the percentage. So you grab a bag of nuts, 17% Brazil, 19% Colombia. You see it. Full transparency about where it came from. And that's a mandatory requirement. In Switzerland, when you make something, it has to be made out of recycled stuff from Switzerland. They created a closed loop. You don't just recycle glass because it's cool. You have to because you have to buy it to make your thing. That's brilliant. And investors have been slow to recognize the need for firms and communities to manage their sustainability, but they're beginning to ask for better, more consistent reporting. Think of the divestment movement. There has been over $1.3 trillion taken out of fossil fuels in the last 5 years alone. Right now, if you're a mainstream person with your mainstream pension in Canada, it's in fossil fuels. Half of my members are renewable companies that don't even know where their pensions are invested in, and most of it's in oil and gas. Think about where your money is. Think about your pension fund, because right now it's fueling the destruction of what we care about. I almost guarantee you it is. Your RSPs, if they're with some main high street bank, they are funding the problem. And what's funny is, if you divest from fossils, you actually make better returns, ironically. So you make more money. Big company in Vancouver called Genus, one of the best investment companies in Canada, exclusively works with non-fossils, all about impact investing. There are ways to do this and make more cash. And community governments. A government can't micromanage the way an economy addresses all aspects of environmental challenge, and as a result, there's going to be greater emphasis placed on communities to take responsibility. At the very beginning, this is going to happen gradually, but if the systems around us fall apart, it's going to be 100% local, baby. That's why we have to do this. So here is a lovely little what's the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius slide. It's quite shocking. I think some of you may know this, but 1.5 to 2 degrees is gigantically different. Right now, we're going to hit 2, 2.5. Right now. We're likely to hit 3, 3.5 with our behavior. I don't have a 3 or 3.5 on this graph, because if I did, you would just really feel depressed. It's bad news. Think about the fact that 30% of human food is produced in alluvial deltas that sits within 0.5 meter of sea level, and those deltas are gone in the next 50 to 80 years. That's what's coming. But yet we want to go to 10 billion people. How? We think this little refugee crisis that's happening south of the American border in Mexico is something? Try 40 million, not 3,000. That's what's coming. And it's not because people want to, it's because desperation. That's what's coming. So right now, many of you may have heard we're in the middle of a great extinction event. 60% of all life forms on the planet have been killed off by us in the last 50 years. If you like polar bears, if you like little things like whales, orcas, lions, they're gone. They are seriously, you're not going to have any in 50 years. They are all gone because of our behavior. Now here's a piece of technology. It'll take us another place. Photovoltaic Thermal, really interesting tech that my other company, I founded a company called Carbon Free Group in the UK, and they're still running. I work with them still, but loosely. We brought a product to market which is called Pbt Photovoltaic Thermal. Now it's a solar panel that does heat and electricity at the same time. They're not separate. And the reason is because you get higher electrical yield. One of these PVT panels will produce about 30% more electricity in the same space as a normal PV panel of exactly the same design, because you cool the panel. You have low temp applications for that heat. You can use that heat and dump it in the ground as a preheat for ground source of geothermal. You can use it as a preheat for hot water. You can use it as even to vent it, you still get more power. What's interesting is you get huge amounts of energy coming out of this thing. Solar panels capture roughly 22% of the energy hitting them as electricity. Solar thermal panels capture roughly about 60% of the energy hits them, but they capture heat, and heat's lower value than electricity. A PVT panel is around 82% in combination. Interesting. And it's perfect for preheating, as I mentioned. So it's a great little example that you can use with technologies. And what we did is created a thing called the Earth Energy Bank. Basically, this is for new buildings. What you do is you dig 1.5 meter deep boreholes underneath where the building's going to be, and you put heat exchangers in them, little ground source systems. You build your foundation and you insulate it and put the building on top, and what you end up with is a gigantic thermal battery that's interseasonal. This is how we're building carbon positive houses in Europe. So there's an example of what they look like. A building that is 100% self-sufficient in its heating and electricity the whole year long. Really interesting piece of tech. Now I'm going to go into some quotes, because I love quotes. The electric light did not come from the continuous improvement of candles. Oh, so beautiful. Redefine wealth from what you have to what you have access to. This is powerful. Rachel, she's just so beautifully, eloquently said this. This is the essence of what you're trying to do here. In all these island communities, micro communities, that's what you have access to. Tool sheds and sharing, food production locally, local economy, local circular models. It's just really where everything is fun. And also, if you care about your neighbors, they generally care a little about you. You know, it's quite a simple thing. Humans did not evolve as a species in gigantic metropolises. We evolved in small communities of about 150 people max. Yeah, it was challenging when you were like the only 15 to 18-year-old girl and there was like one other guy, and if you didn't like him, it sucked. But that's sort of how it was for our species, you know. It's just the life, but that's why we met other communities and traded stuff. Yeah, this is a beautiful one for me. Answers, simple but wrong, or complex but right. That's our civilization. You know, who wants change? Who wants to change? I've been gathering these things for a long time, by the way. I've got a group on Facebook, which I despise, Facebook. It's not social media, it's anti-social media. There's no such thing as social media. But on Facebook, I've got a group called Sustainability Quotes, where I pull together the best quotes I've found throughout my entire career. I'm actually in the process of writing a book on the best quotes I've ever seen, just for fun, because I think that they can be so powerful. One page a quote, the back, my reaction to that quote. I don't really care if people read my bit, but the other bit's really cool. Social purpose business. A friend of mine, Coro Stramborg, if you ever want to know somebody in Vancouver who is a corporate social responsibility guru, Coro is amazing, C-O-R-O. And this is her definition. A social purpose business is a company whose enduring reason for being is to create a better world. It's an engine for good, creating social benefits by the very act of conducting business. Its growth is a positive force on society. It's not a parasite. It's a reinforcer. It has a purpose, it has social ambition, and it has a profit model. It has to make money. If a business doesn't make money, it doesn't matter how great it is, it doesn't survive. But what they mean by profit here is it's economic, it's social, and it's environmental. All those things profit. Here's a lovely graph that shows the Earth's land animals by mass. Humans, we're sitting there in the yellow. If you add in the cattle and the sheep and the pigs and the goats, wow, look what's left. Wild animals are 34 out of that 1,000 million tons. That's all that's left in nature. When I said 60% are gone, that's 60% of species are being made extinct right now. They don't come back. Were any of you aware of this insanity? But this is what we have done to the world. Pets are pretty big. They're in there too. They make up more biomass than all the wild animals. It's shocking. Do you think you could maybe see that and go, I should go home and rethink my life? We just haven't done it yet. Here's one of my favorites with a swear word. Climate change isn't real, climate change is real, we're just not gonna concern about it, oops, and then fuck. There we are. Right now, by the way, we're not in oops. We're past oops. That's where we are. It's funny, but it's not. You have to take that British humor of self-depreciation, taking the piss out of yourself, so vital, because sense of humor is so essential to ride through this shit that's coming. It is vital. And forgive me if you don't like swearing, I tend to swear. The greatest threat to our planet is the belief that someone else will save it. No one is going to save this, except for you, each one of you. Every time you spend money, you're casting a vote for the kind of world you want. Every single time. What you buy, what you support. If you buy something off Amazon, you're supporting a company that doesn't pay taxes. If you buy something off of a chain store over a local store, you're deciding to send that profit elsewhere. These are choices you make. And I know for people who have a limited income, you don't often have many choices. And I get that. But you have to be aware of every single time you spend your money. How many people are aware of the fact that Amazon, last year in the United Kingdom, There's a guy named the Naked Chef. He made about 14 million pounds. He's quite a successful chef. He pointed out 3 weeks ago, I paid more tax than Amazon and eBay did combined together. Amazon made 540 million pounds and eBay 345. They combined together paid less tax than a guy who made 14 million. This is what's happening. Big companies become multinationals, become really powerful, and they determine and tell the political officials how it is they're going to behave. Now, when a company comes in, and I'm not just singling out Amazon, when a company comes in and it doesn't contribute towards the education, the streets, the police, the fire departments, the social cohesion, the society that feeds it, it's a parasite. And that's not good for us, because that company can wipe out the local businesses who actually employ local people, who actually pay for local things. A dollar is not a dollar is not a dollar. You can spend it in 3 different places and have a gigantic range of impact. The economic models for this are called sustainable procurement methodologies, a thing called LM3, local multiplier 3. And what it shows is the variability from those spectrums, from a big multinational that doesn't pay any taxes down to a real local shop that actually buys everything locally. $1 equals 23 cents for the big multinational of impact in the economy. $1 for the micro company is $1.93 of economic models, because that keeps recirculating and repaying itself. That means there's a 6 times difference for every dollar spent from company A to company B. Right now, we don't even think about this when we buy things. That's crazy. Is it cheaper to buy a cheap thing that causes vast amounts of damage? No, it's actually more expensive. Right now, in the globe, we have 7 times as much financial support for fossil fuels as we do for renewable energy. A liter of gas is not $1.45, people. It's like $6 or $7 of impact. We just happen to be casting most of that into the commons, and it's a little thing called climate change. So I love this one. We scientists don't know how to do that. I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address these problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. It's true. This is beautiful. This one should rile up the youth. I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I'm changing the things I cannot accept. Get loud. Get angry. Be constructive. Don't just stare at your phone. It's not going to get you anywhere. Funny thing, 10,000 hours on your phone, it's not going to add 10,000 hours of value to your life. And I know you're hearing this from your parents, and you're like, yeah, whatever. I say it to my kids too. They hate it. The reality is, your most valuable commodity is your attention span. If you could ever nail down what is the most important thing you can give yourself and the world around you, it's your focus. And right now, we have lots of things sucking our focus away from ourselves. There's a book called Sapiens, written by an anthropologist, who basically has studied and analyzed human behavior for his whole career. And he was asked in an interview, what do you think is your most valuable asset? And he said, my attention span. He doesn't have a smartphone. He has a dumb phone that rings and calls people. Because as he said, he wants to choose when he accesses computers and internet, because then he gets to decide how much energy he focuses on them. He said, I waste so much of my life looking at cats' videos. I really learned I can't control myself. He's like, I noticed I can't stop myself, so I have to just stop having this thing. He's an addict, and we're all addicts, by the way. We're addicted to carbon. And that's maybe a big part of this. We need to start viewing ourselves as heroin addicts, because that's exactly what we are. And do you think if you walk up to a heroin addict and say, guess what, you need to stop doing that, it's bad for you, it's killing the things you care about, does that work? No, at all. But that's what we're trying somehow within this governance system around us to say, oh, we're going to change. We're not going to change. Not unless we decide to stop being addicts. And if you get tired, learn to rest, not to quit. Banksy. We have to be aware of the fact that all of us who are trying to change the world get exhausted. We get worn out with the mountain in front of us. We have to learn to rest and not quit. We have to learn to disengage and pop back in again. And that's so important for all of you that are trying to make a difference in your lives. Learn where to back up and rest, because it doesn't do you or anyone any favors if you collapse. And the funny thing is, look at any community group in the world, they've all got champions who have collapsed. Because guess what? The people who show up and do their job are the ones who get more work. It just keeps the cycle going. So there's my Generate conference. If you're at all in Vancouver and want to go see some interesting stuff, let me know. I can give you guys an NGO rate, $250 for 2 days. Thank you very much. Questions?